at the Council on American Islamic Relations and actually litigated cases in the aftermath of some of the policies that were implemented on immigrant procedural delays. I'm just going to give you one example of one of those. The government implemented what were called FBI name checks after 9/11 in this country. This resulted in severe, at times, years of delays for certain people with certain types of names when they went through immigration background checks. So for instance, if your name was Mohammed Reza Alavi and there were another Mohammed Reza something with an FBI file, or somebody that just had Mohammed and had an FBI file, that resulted in them basically pulling every file that had that type of name to review these cases. So you can only imagine what that actually meant. And I litigated a case for an Iranian in Chicago who had been waiting 6 years for his citizenship application to take place. What we found out in the course of our litigation was that he had, in the late 90s, after Khatami came to power, he had been approached by the FBI to become a spy on behalf of the US government towards Iran, and he declined. That he traveled regularly back to Iran to visit friends and family, but he was also a nuclear scientist who worked here in US labs on high security tests and projects, but actually went back to Iran and would give lectures on nuclear issues, his background, profession, what he worked with here. So this is somebody clearly that had his own file at some point or another, and at this point results in these years and years of delay with no answer as to why, simply telling him over and over again, you're going through security checks. So without any bases for justifying the delay in this man's case, and without right now boring you with the legal clauses and bases for which we filed his complaint, they couldn't come up with anything. They basically said, he travels to Iran a lot. That was actually evidence submitted at trial. That he didn't disclose that he went to Germany, because he went to Germany on a layover to Iran for a couple of hours in the airport because there are no direct flights. Things like this were used against him because there was no way to truly deny the application. Ultimately, that was a victory. He got his citizenship. He was sworn in by the judge because the federal government didn't want to swear him in. After much of these events, some of the groups that do some of the Iranian American advocacy and lobby groups did form. In 2002, NIAC formed. In 2007, PAYA, just to name a couple. But we still do not have any economic or diplomatic ties with Iran. And putting aside historic distrust even, the last 8 years of US machismo must and should inform every way that we look at our government's relationship and any policies put forth or advocated for towards Iran. The events after June 12th created not only a transformative relationship for Iranians, but actually for Iranian Americans as well. In a community that, as I've pointed out, hasn't traditionally been civically engaged and has shied away from this, we witnessed the reclamation of citizenry of our brothers and sisters inside of Iran. And that reverberated here in the streets of DC, in New York, and in LA. Suddenly, there were a new batch of activists born out of a profound recognition of our counterparts inside of Iran, a kind of recognition that no cultural center or Farsi school has been able to trigger in many of us. Suddenly to see and read about the social and news media of the heroism of the youth and people in the streets of Iran, it really created a bond for many of us here that was steeped in civic disobedience against oppressive forces versus solely social-based activities. As a result, much of the organizations that came to be, or much of the activism that you see after this date, is marked by the youth. Many of us have felt, and continue, I think, to feel, that this is a new leadership, it's a new time, that you're either with us and you're moving forward past priorly existing and political and independent agendas in support of the movement that we see today on the ground. So that in mind, I want to lead you to sort of where we're at. We are completely speaking from the vantage point of the US-based activists. It is really easy to make the determination to stand in solidarity with the people inside of Iran right now. But it is much more difficult to move forward conscious of the constraints that can be characteristic of any international struggle. In the civil rights movement in this country, when people started to really organize and get engaged, what ended up happening was that the FBI wiretapped calls and monitored everything that they did. And many people who were very active were considered communists. And the Red Scare was used as this way of delegitimizing the movement. This is not unlike what we're seeing right now with Iran. People who are active in the streets are considered enemies of God. People who have been charged, not considered, have actually been charged with being enemies of God. People in the West who come out into the streets in support of the movement, we're trying to pursue or conduct a velvet revolution, that our true intentions are linked to the monarchists, the pro-Shah entity that want to bring back perhaps a constitutional monarchy, and not independent of any of that. So I say this not to dwell on it, but simply to say that this paranoia is intentional, but it's not new, that it's something for us to be mindful of and conscious of, but to not allow it to cripple the actions that we want to do in solidarity with people. When reflecting on global solidarity movements for South Africa, E.S. Reddy, who was the UN Assistant Secretary General at the time, stated that, quote, "The global movement had one thing in common: the respect for the liberation movement, recognition that the liberation struggle was the prerogative of the South African people, and that solidarity movements have to respect their choices. This enabled them to work on parallel lines." Iranians came to the streets initially demanding rights to free and fair elections, and all people have the rights to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural developments. These are rights that are protected under the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, which Iran has ratified. For us to assert from here, in any way, shape, or form, who their leaders should be or what type of system those rights ought to be held within is intrinsically undemocratic. The violation of the rights that are protected in these treaties and these doctrines that Iran has ratified or that Iran should ratify is something that we can advocate to be upheld, or the accountability, at least, of the government towards them. That brings me to what we can do from here, or why we choose to do what we do from here. And one thing that I think many of us need to remind ourselves, and I think some of this was discussed a little bit in the prior panel, was that movements take a long time. That if we're conscious of the fact that if you think about South Africa, that was decades and decades of struggle, of bringing to the attention of a community and to the international community where